encountered a group of people who were practicing Reiki, and I decided to join in with that. And that was quite transformational for me. The experiences I had with the Reiki teacher were of such an extreme nature in terms of the intensities of the energies that were summoned and the opening that I experienced to another world. Sola-Busca was totally unknown to me. And I think it was around 2009 that it was finally purchased from the last private owners. And the Brera Gallery put on this like exhibition and catalogue, and probably it's something connected with that that spurred me to start looking at it. And of course, the thing that strikes you immediately with the Sola-Busca, it's unlike anything you've ever seen in your life before. I think that takes you to a very profound area of esoteric understanding and of occult history that is seldom broached. You know, because of the intertwining of the cult of Saturn with elite politics and power, it doesn't fit in most esotericists' framework.
Welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. For episode number 77, we're joined by Peter Mark Adams. Peter is a Scarlet Imprint, Traditions Corbel Stone Press author, poet and essayist specialising in ethnographies of spirit, sacred landscapes, esotericism, consciousness and healing. In today's show, we discuss his life-changing initiation into Reiki and how this led him to a spirit-informed and scholarly study of the enigmatic Renaissance masterwork known as the Sola-Busca tarot. In the Plus show, we discuss several of the entity and parasite attachment cases that Peter has dealt with in his career as an energy healer, and he gives his thoughts on the purpose of this type of event in one's life. It's really an extraordinary conversation. Now, before we start, I'd like to thank the Ankh patron members for their support. Icaro, William O, Robert W, Roland B, Steph, Tim, Tao, Wei, Pamela, Michelle, Merrily, Marco, Jen, Hannah, Flora, Eric, Desiree, Austin, Ali, Carrie S, Brennan, Tyler, Madeline, Jorge, and Tony. Thank you so much for your support. I really, really appreciate it. Now, if you'd like to support the show, but Patreon isn't your thing, you can always buy me a coffee via the link in the show notes. Or just give me the old 5-star review. Every 5-star rating helps. I'm always interested in people's experiences with the other, from hauntings to shadow people, so if you have a story to tell, I'd love to hear about it. Equally, if you think there's a guest that should be in the show, give me a shout. Right, let's get into it. On with the show. Peter Mark Adams, you're very, very welcome to the Spirit Box.
Hi there, Dara. Known of your name for a long time, and it's wonderful to not only be able to talk to you, I can actually see you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show, and you've been one of those names that's been on my list since I kind of started this project. So I'm really chuffed to have you on the show. And equally, I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. We're going to talk through some of your work today, and perhaps kind of some of the work that maybe you're not as well known for in occult circles around the kind of the healing work you do, and some of the interesting spirit attachment work that you covered in some of that work. I keep saying work for some reason, but anyway,
that's good enough.
Yeah. So to get things moving, it would be great if you could give kind of an introduction to you and your work for our listeners.
Okay. I'll probably start. I mean, I could start very early in life, but let's pass through all of that. And about 25 years ago, I encountered a group of people who were practicing Reiki, and I decided to join in with that. And that was quite transformational for me. The experiences I had with the Reiki teacher were of such an extreme nature in terms of the intensities of the energies that were summoned and the opening that I experienced to another world as a direct perceptual item. Okay, and I can briefly give you the case. One particular teacher, my partner and I were going to work with, this extraordinary woman. We met with her and we were chatting about the path. And I started to notice these blobs of green, emerald green in my visual field. So I was like rubbing my eyes and they wouldn't go away. I was looking out the window and there was nothing there, you know. So every time I turned my attention back to her, these blobs grew larger and started to coalesce. And then they seemed to be flowing over the surface of her skin like oil paint. This is a bright emerald effect it had.
Right.
And there was streams of a very pure, rich blue in it. And this was absolutely extraordinary experience. And as I paid attention to what she was saying, it grew and grew. So that I eventually saw she was emanating this emerald green aura, you know, for, I don't know, 10 or 12 centimeters all around herself.
Mm.
And it was that attunement that I underwent at that time that kind of opened the door, that allowed me to start seeing the entities and beings, to be very much aware of their presence in a way that I hadn't been before. And certainly in a way which is far more comfortable, rather than you know, the childhood terrors that some sensitive children have, and which go on for years after. But here was something else on another frequency, and after that, we embarked on a very systematic program of providing healing, teaching, and initiation for, I don't know, it must have been 10 years. That's almost every weekend and 2 nights every week. We're busy with that. And it was in that context that we had so many extraordinary healing experiences. Okay, so it was, I think, that hands-on, literally hands-on connection with the energy, with the healing and the spirits that drive those processes, that for me opened the door to other gateways, one of which turned out to be the game of Saturn and the cult of Saturn embodied within it.
I'm really pleased to hear you kind of really talk about Reiki and what its real potency is. And I think a lot of people don't realize it, particularly in occult circles. So
I think it's become commodified to an extent. So a lot of people get it, but don't get it, so to speak. They don't realize that the initiation is a start of a process that should go on for at least a month after, wherein you give up alcohol, smoking, you stop eating red meat, you clarify and cleanse the channels, and you give Reiki every day for a substantial period. And it's necessary to overcome the inertia of a Western lifestyle. And it's only when you do that, like a month down line, that you really begin to feel the energy coming through. And it's around that time as well, you become aware of the spiritual presences that are the essence of the Reiki energy.
Right.
And it's ironic, as you say, that so many people in esoteric circles look down on Reiki because they have this view of this commodified, simple. But in fact, what they're looking down upon is a pure act of spiritual entities working through us to effect healing.
Right.
Because it's not our energy, of course. We're not doing bioenergy here. We're channeling another worldly energy. And it has all the non-local, atemporal qualities of a pure spiritual energy.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, that really resonates. And I've noticed as well, and I've heard this from other Reiki practitioners, is that when they are kind of fully Reiki attuned and are practicing, when they actually try other type of occult ritual where they're charging a room or something, get a lot stronger reaction. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
they definitely get there faster.
I think again, there's a kind of underlying materialism in the outlook of a lot of people
Mhm.
in the esoteric community, and it's almost as though the magic is theirs, when in fact the most powerful magic is the channeled magic.
Mhm.
It's when you bring through a deity, various high-level entities,
Yeah.
various spiritual traditions have these spiritual forces within them. They have agency, and they have a clear sense of purpose. And if your lifestyle doesn't align with their purpose, then it's not likely that you're going to make contact with them. It is not.
Yeah.
It's not a spectator sport.
I like
It's
that.
not like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not like ghost hunting. You go
Mm.
looking for ghosts, go looking for spirits. They've got better things to do,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
most of them have a very pointed purpose in life. And it's
Mhm.
only your alignment with that that allows them to communicate with you.
Mhm. Yeah, and indeed, they will give instruction directly
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
amend one's lifestyle,
Yeah.
to achieve that deeper connection.
It's interesting in that respect that sometimes the instruction comes through what we would call egregoric forms that you don't actually have a connection with in this lifetime. And I can give you one good example. Again, working with that same teacher, during a meditation, I found myself in this room, in this like dream space,
Mhm.
with a black and white checkered floor. And on the right, there was a coffin. And in that, I was lying in that coffin. And the strange thing is, there was like a track that led off the other way, which I followed, and it suddenly turned vertical and entered this pure area of light. Now, this was extraordinary because my partner had exactly the same vision.
Wow.
But after I'd entered that light, in the subsequent days, I totally just stopped smoking and drinking.
Mhm.
Immediately and permanently. Yeah, I didn't give it up. I just stopped. So
Wow.
that was definitely the third degree egregore of the Masonic Lodge
Yeah.
that it took. I'm not a Mason, by the way, but who
Yeah.
knows in
Yeah.
past lives.
Yeah.
And in a subsequent meditation, my partner went into the same space, saw this huge tongue unroll from a lectern across this floor,
Wow.
and heard this booming voice, a well-hung tongue. And it was weeks later, I was reading Andrew Sinclair, the novelist, and he's a descendant of the Sinclairs of Roslin.
Yeah.
His book about the ancestors. And in there, he quotes a short fragment of a Masonic ritual from, I think, 17th century. And you can imagine my amazement. I read this, and there it was. A well-hung tongue was part of the ritual response.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's incredible.
anyway.
And I suppose this is leading us into the area of being somehow gently nudged by kind of your spirit work into areas of more deeper, I guess, deeper investigation and then kind of revelation with the Sola-Busca. I'm really interested to hear that connection, as we were chatting just before we hit record, about how that kind of the development of your work in Reiki, your insight, developing, and you're getting that sense of, I know what's internal in terms of my thoughts and the images within my internal world, and then very clearly kind of understanding, right, this is external, this is something else communicating me and understanding and developing that relationship with the external, and that through your Reiki work and into Sola-Busca. That's a very, very long-winded, protracted way of asking that question. So
How did it get started?
yeah. How did it get started?
Well, I guess I must have been in 15 years of energy healing work at this point, that Sola-Busca just sprang out of left field. I'd never heard of this card deck ever before, even though I've been interested in tarot from when I was like 12 or 13.
Right.
Sola-Busca was totally unknown to me. And I think it was around 2009 that it was finally purchased from the last private owners. And the Breuer Gallery put on this like exhibition and catalog. And probably it's something connected with that that spurred me to start looking at it. And of course, the thing that strikes you immediately with the Sola-Busca, it's unlike anything you've ever seen in your life before. So, that was a puzzle, but it became it suddenly took on the force of a kind of obsession with me. I became convinced that it was encoded, heavily encoded, and that if I could only figure out what that code was, I would read something extraordinary in it. And I started work on it. I must say it was 2013, 2014, probably. And I worked day and night on it. I had that kind of energy, or that kind of energy came to me to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week on it. And finally, I started cracking into its thought process, the thought process behind the person who'd encoded it.
Right.
And as I did so, I got deeper into the metaphysics that it embodied. And as I got into the metaphysics, I started having the onset of massive energy surges. Some of them were so intense, I would have to lie in bed for 3 or 4 days. It's kind of, your whole body is overcharged with energy. And my God, I've had some strong initiations in my time, but this was like the sledgehammer of all initiations. I could hardly move for like 3 days at a time, man.
Wow.
And with that, though, here's an interesting thing that as the project progressed, my partner started hearing a voice, and this went on all day long, and it said Elohim, Elohim, Elohim all day long. And she kept coming to me and saying, "You've got to check this Elohim out." And I was thinking, I could only think of Elohim,
Yeah.
There's nothing Judaic in this. So, and again, I was reading Eusebius of Caesarea, in the early part of his book, he has preserved some very ancient fragments of Hellenistic metaphysics. There are the original texts are long lost.
Right.
And one of them was a tiny fragment. And you imagine my amazement. It said, another name for Saturn is Elos, and the followers of Saturn are called the Elohim.
Wow.
And at that point, I was like, oh, okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So this project of bringing out the game of Saturn, and in particular its ritual praxis, has been for me a major unveiling and a guided unveiling of a core of metaphysics that is obviously important in some way,
right,
to some people. Yeah.
That's a really really intense kind of how it all kicked off. Sounds like really quite full on. And when you started getting into the cards and the symbolism, and as I said, when we spoke beforehand, it was like that kind of domino effect of one started to reveal. One symbol would reveal its some of its layered meaning, and then you'd get deeper into the rest of it. Can you take us through the kind of the first aha moment, if there is a discernible first one, right? But when
there absolutely was. Looking at two of the cards, I was searching for some patterns. There had to be a pattern there. I just couldn't discern it because of the scattered nature of the cards. Not only have they encoded the images on each card, they had scattered them through the 78 card deck. Okay. So within the trumps, however, two of the cards had a resonance, and the numeration on them was like 2, which could also be read as 11. And 11, I looked at these two cards, and the two figures both had torches, one held down and one held up, and they both were dressed in the same colors, except, the hat was one color in one card, and it was the leggings in the other card, and so on. So actually they were symmetrical. And there was only one possible iconographic source for this, and that are the two torchbearers in the Mithraic mysteries. On either side of the tauroctony, there is always two figures, one with a upraised and one with a downraised torch. And they represent the solstices and the Platonic gates of the sun. That's to say, the pathways by which souls ingress into material reality and egress out of it. And of course, egressing out of it is in the sign of Capricorn in the winter solstice. And that, of course, is the period of Saturn and Saturnalia. And that's gave me the clue that maybe I was being directed towards some form of theurgy. Because I know from Neoplatonic writing that the ascent of the soul before death is the key act of theurgy, and it's done through possession by the deity, the presiding deity of that ritual, which must be Saturn.
Right.
So that's a huge chunk of metaphysics that I could then start looking at the imagery through a new lens, so to speak. And sure enough, in one of the final cards, there was the globe, and there were the bands indicating the solstice and a dragon figure on top. So it was this kind of process, continuously absorbing the imagery, but then going back to primary sources in Mithraism, in Neoplatonism, and looking at the Renaissance context of the mid-15th to late 15th century to answer the question, what texts would they have had access to at that time? And what other imagery, certainly in Ferrara, where we believe the deck was made, supports this kind of level, this metaphysical sophistication.
Right.
And that's when, filling in the background, the historical and social and cultural background began to give my interpretation of the cards real ballast. It really, they grew legs and started to walk then, as a thesis. So I knew I was on the way at that point.
Fantastic. And to help kind of ground some of our listeners, can you give us some of that like historical context of like when where the cards are believed to be from, like the time period they were created, or indeed if it was it possible for you to identify historic individuals involved, or is that kind of lost in time?
Yeah, I believe I have identified the designer, the conceptual designer, the artist who executed it. We know him from other work, very high level engraving work that has been identified. He's generally referred to as the master of the Sola-Busca Tarocchi. And these other engravings are like gathered together around the Sola-Busca. So, he was a well-known Ferrarese artist of the age, but there's some debate about which particular person it might have been.
Right.
Okay. But it's a coherent body of Ferrarese artwork. So the conceptual design is of another order of sophistication, however. And let me fill a little background in. In Ferrara, there was one commanding presence throughout the later 15th century, and that was Prisciani. He was one of these Renaissance polymaths, and he was a central organizing figure at the Ferrarese court of the d'Este. So he was a professor of mathematics. He learned Hebrew. He was an astrologer, astronomer. He ran the library there. He had access to all the classical texts and gathered them and supervised. I mean, he was a diplomat and he was a magistrate. He's just, one of these incredible Renaissance figures. Yeah. What he was absolutely, we're sure, in his younger years, he was responsible for the cycle of the Palazzo Schifanoia, which is to say the incredible room in the Palazzo Schifanoia, which has the frescoes of the months of the year, and it's in a multi-layer, like 3-layered design, so that at the very top you have 12 deities, and then under them you have the decans, which are straight out of, for instance, medieval Goetic texts.
Wow.
But like the Picatrix, but actually go back to about 2000 BC. And they've all been illustrated there, so that 3 of them in each month. And then under that is the court, the life of the court in each month of the year, throughout the year. And this is actually, I mean, it's not just a decoration, it's actually a talisman, because the sun and moon have been positioned in there, and the windows organized to actually shine light on certain parts of the fresco cycle to commemorate key events. So he designed this when he was quite young. So, you know, that'd be around 1450 or so. So by 1490, he was a very senior figure at the court. And he's the only person I could identify with all the background requirements necessary for the job. Now, the extraordinary thing is that he embodied a Hellenistic metaphysics.
Okay.
I mean, all of Europe was ripe with Goetic sorcery at that time. Every single court across Europe had its resident magicians, sorcerers.
Yeah.
You know, they worked for hire, they cast spells, they sent demons against people and so on. And certainly the Este were no exception to that. They had a very notorious sorcerer working for them. And all these sorcerers were clerics, by the way. Some of them ordained priests, some of them monks and everything, doing God's work.
Yeah.
And so it's extraordinary that Prisciani should have not turned towards these classical sources of magical tradition, but instead went to a Hellenistic outlook and system that could only have reached him through Byzantium.
Wow.
And we know, well, I'm pretty sure who that connecting person was, George Gemistus, and also known as Platon. And he was one of the commanding intellects of the age, certainly the leading Platonic scholar, and also a dedicated Hellenistic ritualist. Okay, and he was in Italy 1438 to 39, and I'm sure that he met the previous Duke of Ferrara at that time. And there seems to have, and also one of his most important students became a cardinal in the Roman Church in Rome.
Right.
And he organized this underground group who met in the catacombs, in the depths of the catacombs, by the way, for all kinds of nefarious rites. So there's a very, at the elite levels of society, there was a very interesting pagan influenced movement in place. You know, it doesn't actually accord with our normal history and art history, but actually the leading figures of that age were very often very strongly influenced by a Hellenistic outlook. They were pagans, quite simply.
Right. Okay.
And so you had a lot of masking of that pagan intent through church imagery. So you have this interplay between Renaissance art and its pagan roots, that certainly from the 1450s onwards, when they say the second Renaissance started, a Hellenistically, stylistically Hellenistic Renaissance started. So that, in a kind of nutshell, is some of the background. The date at which it was produced was around 1491, and it has distinctive marks of Venetian patrician ownership painted on it. They weren't on the original engravings, but the printed copy was decorated for a Venetian patrician, who I'm almost certain was Marin Sanudo, who became later one of the great documenters of Venetian life. He's like the go-to person for historical research on Venetian life and times in that period. So he was involved after a war between Venice and Ferrara. He was involved in the negotiations for reparations that Ferrara was after. And 1491, they finally won the legal battle, began to receive reparations. And as if by magic, this deck of cards appears with his coats of arms, both paternal and maternal coats of arms, painted on it. So it looks like there'd been some deal made.
Yeah. For services rendered.
Something like that, yeah. And in fact, the Venetian state never trusted him thereafter.
Right.
He was long after the post of writing the official history of Venice. He was the only person, qualified to do it, and they refused to give him the job time and again. So he'd clearly fallen, as a member of the patrician, the Sanudo family, one of the most important families in Venice. So for a scion of that family to be in disfavor, he would have had to really do something awful. So I guess he sold them out. He always had money problems, so I'm sure they knew it.
That's why, in many ways, that it's a very old story, that particular element of it. What was I going to say is so it's because I was thinking about that idea of like, well, if this individual may have had other allegiances based on religious practice, or that the kind of the hidden paganism that you mentioned, and whether that might have been a motivation, but it's clear that there would have been maybe an empty purse may have been more of the motivation at the time.
Aside from the historical background to this thing, what was important for me was to see an instantiation, an example of a cult of Saturn that people have talked about very often in esoteric circles. But here at last was concrete evidence of a functioning cult, its ritual praxis, its metaphysics, and its employment by the Renaissance elite. And that for me was more important than the historical discoveries, to be honest. Do you want to say anything about that?
I mean, that's huge, and it's one of those things that I imagine when you were kind of unpacking that. Like, did you feel at one stage kind of going, we're getting into territory that was uncomfortable or moving you away from esoteric exploration, or did you feel it was like a necessary thread to pull?
Well, it felt necessary, but it felt like I was getting into the eyes wide shut world, to be honest. Because the d'Este are one of the very ancient families of Europe. They're 600-700 years old at the point in the 15th century.
Wow.
And they would go on to, one of them became Queen of England, and another branch of the family is like the Hanoverian monarchs. So they're totally intertwined with the governing elites during the 15th, 16th, 17th into the 18th century.
Wow.
So that, and that is a significant period of empire. So to peel back the layers of what they really believed, because they had a praxis, they had a ritual process to support it, was like, talk about, blinders coming off your eyes. That was amazing. And the fact that that cult of Saturn had such profound roots in the Hellenistic tradition was also fascinating for me. It was not something that had been self-evident. So it did cause me to ask, what was the nature of that tradition? Why was it so long-lived? And why did it manifest continuously in so many forms for so long? And I think that takes you to a very profound area of esoteric understanding and of occult history that is seldom broached. Because of the intertwining of the cult of Saturn with elite politics and power, it doesn't fit in most esotericists' framework. The way they view things, their lives, the orders they belong to. This is a cult that has a multitude of applications, but which in this particular context is underpinning elite power and control, and is specifically ordered and designed to do that. And I believe that it came as a piece from Byzantium into the Renaissance elite. It was deliberately transferred, just as Constantinople fell, 1453, so that it represents, in fact, the core of the Hellenistic tradition, metaphysically and in terms of ritual practice. And that's extraordinary, because I hadn't had that perspective before.
It is extraordinary, and kind of, as you've already pointed out, that to find something almost in I wouldn't say a complete corpus, obviously, but a map of the praxis is remarkable.
Yeah.
And that
I think it's
direct line.
quite.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's something it's kind of on people's or it's current right now because of the recent re-release by Theon Books, The Cult of the Black Cube. And in that, David Beth has an excellent essay, which is really well worth reading as a summary of what a contemporary cult of Saturn believes and what it seeks to achieve. And there's such a close overlay between 15th century Hellenistic and the modern cult of Saturn metaphysically. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's like the contour of something that is deeply interwoven into the European cultural, and possibly, I mean, the book, The Cult of the Black Cube, covers the cult of Saturn in cultures all around the world. It's another, for myself, for the game of Saturn, the imagery of the deck had a clear connection to Africa, to the cult of Baal-Hamon, also known as Moloch in the Bible. Okay, so again, that was a disturbing thread to find, because of course Moloch is known for one thing and one thing alone, which is the immolation of small children. And to think that this Renaissance tarot deck, this civilized Renaissance tarot deck, has so many connections to Ammon as a form of the cult of Saturn is again, it's like some very deep thread that has its own life, its own continuity, and surfaces in different contexts, in different historical ages, with slightly different face on it, but a fairly consistent metaphysics.
Right.
So this to me is the kind of characteristics you would expect of one of the yoga tantras, the higher yoga tantras of the Indo-Tibetan cultural zone. This has the same sense of the continuity of a set of entities, beings, who have a powerful presence that can be invoked and bestow. What do they bestow? Well, they bestow awareness of the intelligible world, of I suppose you would want to say, the illusion of linear time, the illusion of dying and losing something. They point towards an ever-present time, a time of myth, a cyclic time, if you want, which raises you as an individual from a suffering, contingent state of being to a state of eternally existing, So there's a shift in awareness that needs to take place for that to be realized, at least momentarily. You may or may not be able to stabilize such high-level states of awareness, but to have at least been illumined by that state on at least one occasion changes your perspective on life. Okay, and that's what I saw that this cult was giving. It was giving that level of illumination. But because of the experience I had writing the book, the influx of energy was so intense. I also saw it as empowering an individual. And, if you consider the position of a Renaissance prince in the medieval period, everything depended on their martial and diplomatic ability. I mean, literally, the entire fate of the city-state rested on that. So you can imagine the benefits that would be accrued from invoking such an entity in terms of the clarity of perception it gives, the freedom from fear, and the energy to drive forward. That kind of, and it's for that reason that throughout the imagery of the deck, we have this image of the dragon, the draconian current. And I suspect that is really what is at the core of the cult of Saturn.
And is that a specific entity to that end?
We never know, because we only see these entities through an egregore, through an accumulation of images in the unconscious or the collective unconscious, I should say. We never see the thing behind it. And I suspect they're of such high frequency, we couldn't make sense of them anyway.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's what's going on. So whenever you engage with the cult of Saturn, you engage with its egregore. And within that egregore, there will be its accumulated imagery, symbolism, and that's how you'll experience it, I would guess. But behind it, what you're asking, what it is in itself, is so far beyond us.
Right, yeah, okay.
We're talking about a formidable, multi-dimensional entity. It's not without reason that the Indo-Tibetan deities are shown multi-armed, for instance. Okay, so there's a reason for that. Of course, each hand has a different symbol.
Yeah,
but it's a hint.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think that's that's a useful explanation in terms of comparing to Hindu and some Buddhist representations of these entities.
I just remembered that essay by the name is Clavis Saturni by David Beth. I really recommend it. Okay. It's excellent.
Let me just take it out.
It's in the Cult of the Black Cube, Theon. Again, that's an excellent book. It's one of the important books about the whole Saturn thing today. I can't think of another one. The game of Saturn, of course, is a historical instantiation of that cult. But the importance of it is that it gives a ritual sequence that anyone could follow. So that if you wanted to resurrect the ritual praxis for yourself, you can do so from the ritual process in the game of Saturn. And that was one of the extraordinary breakthrough moments working with those cards, when I realized that they were actually depicting the stages of ritual, posturally, gesturally, and in terms of the implements being employed at each stage.
Can you take us through some of that ritual?
Yeah, it's as I said, when you come to the practical side of any cult, in essence, you're working with the myth cycle of the deity in your own tradition, or whichever tradition you're working in. So for Kronos Saturn, that's he eats the children, obviously. So it has to be a part of the ritual. So what they've done is they have collected semen and mensae. So they've created the basis of life, theoretically, symbolically. And certainly in the Renaissance mindset, that would have been a real life, a homunculus.
Right.
Okay, so they have that. They then collect the celestial energies that they want to bring down into this menstruum. And the cards are quite clear, all the malefic, astral, planetary, fixed stars, constellations that you can imagine are encoded in the cards, and they are brought down using a ritual which goes back, I don't know, it must be 4,000, 5,000 years ago, drawing down the moon. Okay, this ritual is invoked. The card clearly depicts this ritual being performed on a waning moon with kind of open vessel in which the menses and the semen will be held. And of course, all the astrological calculations and timings would be such as to allow it to draw the energy and infuse the menstruum with it. A subsequent card then shows the menstruum as a small child being dangled over or dropped into a fire. So symbolically, they've now enacted the deity's core myth. They then start a process of classical Hellenistic invocation. And in fact, we know what that is because one of Ficino's students, Diacetto, wrote the whole thing down in his diary. Right. You know, okay, you dress in all the qualities of the deity you want to invoke. You have all the incense, the crystals, all the, and then you cast your passion and mind to the deity. So it's all described there, and it's depicted in the cards. It's showing the mage dressed in Saturnian colors. He's got the ram. He's on a throne with ram kind of arms on it, and he's got a hat fashioned like a dragon. And he's in the process. He's got like a spinning top with flames coming out of it on top of a column, and then this is Hecate's top. Again, it's from the Chaldean oracles.
Right.
And then the next card on, he's got these huge wings, like a dragon, but he's dressed as a monk with a golden diadem on his head. It's a very bizarre card. And it's one of the few cards that actually shows some sign of wear and tear, as though it's been held by somebody's thumbs on either side. It's the only card to show wear and tear. Wow. It's interesting, as though the card perhaps was employed in ritual. And we certainly know of the use of tarot cards in ritual because, of course, they're so handy. You can just set them up on an altar with a couple of candles and what have you, And I suspect that this deck could be and has been used in that way before. And that's pretty well it. So that's the ritual process. And then there's a couple of cards further on, right at the end of the deck. There's a couple of trumps that seem to indicate a connection to Nimrod. Now, Nimrod is a strange connection because, of course, he was one of the offspring of the mating of the angels, the fallen angels, the watchers, and human women. Okay, so I found that curious. And then I realized that most of the Italian elite families traced their heritage, to what extent they were serious about it's difficult to tell, to Troy. It's the whole story of Virgil's Aeneid and the defeats, and the Trojans go off and wander around. They go to Carthage and then end up and they found Rome, Saturnia. So they trace their spiritual heritage, at least back to Troy. And the Troy in the myths, going back to Herodotus, and in Strabo, especially Strabo's geographer, describes Troy as the home of the Azoetia. And recall that Andrew Chumbley had one of his books called Azoetia. It's the serpent tribe.
Right.
So again, the draconian current is invoked in numerous ways. Another way it's invoked in the cards is in the court cards. They're all focused on the conception of Alexander the Great, not on anything he actually did in his life. On the one story that describes his conception by the god Ammon in the form of a dragon. So again, it's another prompt, if you needed another one, that this deck is the ritual process that embodies and invokes the draconian current in its most energized, most fiery form, the draconian serpent Ammon, Baal Hammon, also known as Kronos, Saturn, but not the planetary intelligence. This is a hypercosmic deity that's being addressed. So, wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aren't you glad you asked?
Jesus Christ, Peter. that was a remarkable.
There's no Jesus in this.
Yeah. That remarkable.
And
Thank
it's
you.
interesting because the card doesn't have one iota of Christian symbolism in it.
Yeah.
40, 50, for God's sake,
Yeah, totally.
It's not a Christian symbol even in the whole deck.
I mean, it's an absolutely remarkable piece of work. Thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Well, I think it was just channeled through me, to be honest, Dara. I don't really, say God knows why, but it seems to have been timely in some fashion that we're yet to see.
See, that's the channeling bit I'm really interested in. That's the question that I did want to ask you about, that kind of the whole process of like when you first kind of got that initiation and it knocked you for six for a couple of days, and then that drive and all the kind of the information and clues coming through.
Yeah.
Now this might be an impossible question to really answer. So this is my specialty in asking really annoying protracted questions.
Go for it.
But do you have a sense of what it was that was communing with you? Like not necessarily the motivation, but like the idea of like, was it part of that draconian current, or was it something else?
Absolutely. I mean, the energy was so fierce. I mean, even as a professional energy work, I was doing Reiki, I was doing rebirthing breath work, which is real high energy stuff.
Yeah.
But this energy was of an order of power and fierceness, which absolutely, blew me away.
Yeah.
To be paralyzed for 3 days, literally unable to move with this burning energy in you. It's you can't miss it. There was no, and on top of that, the thing with the Elohim, it was like, here's the signs following now.
Yeah.
There's the name, and then the context comes later.
Yeah,
a week or so later.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Really remarkable. Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I've really, really enjoyed this time. It's flown by.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Where's the best place for people to find you and your work if they want to find out more about what?
petermarkadams.com, or my YouTube channel has various, podcasts and book launches and stuff on it. And most of the cases, these extraordinary cases, as you mentioned, are in the new book coming out in January, The Power of the Healing Field.
Fantastic.
And basically that book sets out to answer a question. What does a model of consciousness need to look like to accommodate the most extraordinary cases of psychic information transfer, healing, and spiritual experience? So I've kind of crammed into that book all the experiences of a quarter century of intense healing and meditative and spiritual work. So it's out from Inner Traditions, January. So
well,
anyone's interested.
Maybe I can tempt you back on in January and we can talk through that. But yeah. Have
Love
you?
to.
Yeah, brilliant.
Love
Great.
to.
Fantastic. Right, it's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dara. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a hugely enjoyable conversation, and that time just absolutely flew by. If you want to know more about Peter and his work, then do follow the links in the show notes. He's got some interesting work coming up, so it's worth keeping an eye on what he's up to. Right, that's it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care and talk soon.